we are going to move now to Mónica Burguera's presentation. The floor is yours, Mónica.
Okay, thanks, Sandra. Well, I want to thank Monica for giving me the opportunity to be here organizing this. I want to thank Inma for her great work so far. I mean, to this point, and to the rest of the staff, for my colleagues and friends, Carolina, Maria, Laura. It's a pleasure to be here. We're so lucky to have you all guys here. So what I'm going to present today is very much a work in progress, but I hope to be able to convey the kinds of questions and problems that I would like to address in it. My work focuses on the second third of the 19th century, which I find was a crucial period throughout Europe for the making of modern class and gender categories associated with industrialism and the social question. Which ran the social question hand in hand with the women's question, and in a key time for the framing of discussions on citizenship and, in particular, women's citizenship. In this context, I have been working on two women writers, Gertrudis Gómez de Avellaneda and Carolina Coronado, the so-called Las Románticas, after Susan Kirkpatrick's very influential book and very good book, published in 1989. However, it's that label as romanticas that I want to at least problematize, precisely by realizing how these women embodied and mobilized in an overtly liberal context many of the key tensions brought about by the revisited Catholic Enlightenment conveyed in some of the panels here. In 1839, Gertrudis Gómez de Avellaneda dedicated to Ignacio Cepeda, with whom he had a long but intermittent relationship, the well-known autobiographical booklet in which she introduced herself and declared her love for him. The writer had arrived in Spain from Cuba, Gómez de Avellaneda, from Cuba a few years before, and was already glimpsing her own celebrity in Madrid, the cradle of national literary recognition in Spain. From the beginning, she took on in all her intimate letters a role that was difficult to reconcile with the feminine ideal of modesty and restraint. Avellaneda already represented in public and in private, in the intimacy of her love letters, an exceptional femininity along the lines of Madame de Staël's Corinne, in all her attributes and intentions, and all Corinne's attributes and intentions, that was different, a femininity that was different by nature from that of other women. She wrote to Cepeda, I quote her, "I don't know if another woman in my position would speak like that with regard to you, but I have already said 1,000 times that I do not think like the average woman, and that my way of acting and feeling belongs exclusively to me." End quote. Avellaneda embodied, before her lover first and before her public later, the drama of the talented, genial, romantic woman who shifted between the masculinization of her character and the intellect and the femininity of her body and desire. That writer, quote, "with the soul of a poet and the heart of a woman," end quote, trapped in an irresolvable vital tension that led her to a destiny in solitude, forever flowing the attributes of femininity and invading those of masculinity. As she confessed to him some years later, quote her, "judged by society, which does not understand me, and tired of a kind of life that perhaps ridicules me. Superior and inferior to my sex, I find myself a foreigner in the world, and isolated in nature. I feel the need to die," end quote. Her relationship with Ignacio Cepeda was woven over the years, always overshadowed by this apparent lack of reciprocity and by that underlying difficulty of complementing each other in an intellectual equality that have not only conditioned her relationship with Cepeda, but with other men in her life. This same irresolvable tension ran through the life and work of Carolina Coronado, the other great writer of the romantic cultural and political field that was forged in Spain, from its capital, from Madrid, and in the mid-30s and above all throughout the 40s. She expressed it clearly in the original, daring, and polemical work, Los Genios Gemelos, in which she compared Santa Teresa with the Greek women poet Sappho. Coronado wrote this in 1850 when, like Avellaneda, she embodied the other great literary celebrity of Madrid's broad liberal and romantic spectrum, the other complete and exceptional writer who also imagined the vital destiny of female genius in solitude, aware that, I quote, the intellectual superiority of woman will eternally be a barrier that separates her from men's desire, end quote. As in the case of Avellaneda, therefore, Coronado's desiring, creative, and romantic femininity challenged by definition, almost unwittingly, the stability of the liberal imaginary around the essential and hierarchical complementarity between the sexes through marriage. As female literary celebrities, a new phenomenon in those revolutionary romantic Spain during the 1840s, so Avellaneda and Coronado were part of a recurrent metaphor about the complementary sexual order that ought to incorporate women into the nation's public sphere of literary acknowledgement, but as exceptions. They always appeared as that exceptional but indispensable, highly visible, however marginal, female complement. Their exceptionality naturalized and normalized the complementarity of sexes in which the rest of the women did fit. But at the same time, by functioning as models of femininity, they also contain a clear transgressive effect that cannot be underestimated and that remained in the critical conceptions of feminism in the final decades of the century. What I'm interested in suggesting is how both of them dramatized in their lives and in their work the irresolvable tension between talent and love, between mind and the heart, between being an individual and being a woman. A tension that remained in their works and throughout all their lives as public figures, and I do not intend to develop here how both approached this tension over time, and I wouldn't have the time, but rather I do intend to point out in what ways problematizing their conceptualization and performance of love and loving, marriage and affections, as we have seen, provides us with some interpretative clues about the formation of subjectivity and its implications when rethinking the central third of the 19th century in Spain in relation to sexual difference and the origins of liberal society. A biographical analytical strategy is particularly interesting here, I think, to illuminate the changing contradictions of the lives, words, and public meanings of two women whose images were entangled through a recurring game of mirrors. This cacophony between the two writers is especially relevant to understand a period central for the institutionalization of sexual difference, as it was in Europe. I mean, in Spain, as it was in Europe. On the one hand, I want to highlight the tension between talent and love, genius and affection, and the deep instability that a potential horizon of equality between the sexes, however exceptional and unlikely it may have been, engendered in the midst of a political debate on citizenship and political, rational, intellectual, and affective capabilities of citizenship and capabilities. On the other hand, I want to explore how these women adapted and reworked their celebrity in changing discursive context, maintaining, however, continuity precisely through this personal universe of longings, desires, and frustrations expressed in that tension between their privileged minds and their intimate sentimental disaffection or amorous thrills. This recurring tension was central to their public drama and popularity, and also a motive of their intimate, real, or living selves. Studies in gender and romanticism in the last decades have looked at the ways in which women, particularly women writers, re-elaborated male romantic ideals of love, in which women were considered a passive object of desire. Reassessing and revalorizing sentiments and emotions opened up the possibility for women to conceive of themselves as creative and desiring acting subjects. In Spain, both in literary studies and gender historiography, the idea of that romanticism allowed some women, these romanticas, to express a feminine and critical literary voice. Well, the fact that they could do that has already been established, it's unquestionable. I mean, we know that. But this notion, however, was said or faced within the historical narrative as either an exceptional episode that had ended up being diluted by the weight of the previous Catholic traditionalism and the effect of the counter-reformist female domesticity models of the 17th century, like La Perfecta Casada de San Juan de la Cruz, or, in a more recent view, it ended up succumbing to a modern domesticity that gradually confined women and progressively restricted their access to the public space. Well, it seems to me that behind both interpretations lies a somewhat idealized conception of female subjectivity, about which feminist new biography has been warning us for some time now. Subjectivity that is placed outside discourse, that implicitly precedes its significant context, languages, that precedes its own work, its experience, and its practices, and is almost naturally disposed to feel the chance through which she can claim the spaces of emancipation, generally associated with the conquest of the public space and full political citizenship. So it's like this subjectivity is almost in hiding, ready to show up whenever there's a chance and ready to assault this public space. On the contrary, I think that Avellaneda and Coronado were in the first place the product of a multiplicity of overlapping and contradictory discursive contexts. Fred Parker has recently drawn attention to how even in expressing their most intimate feelings or affections, such as the declaration of love in Avellaneda's booklet, with which I began, subjects reproduce a set of voices, expectations, and social meanings that transcends them and that also constitute their identity. This collection of voices, this intertwined polyphony, is even more complex and richer in those women writers whose private lives became part of their public image and public debate. Avellaneda and Coronado, therefore, were products of their time and emerged from alternative liberal political cultures, former moderate and the later progressive, as icons around which created excellence and sexual disorder, intellectual capacity, education, and public influence of women were debated. The power of the recurrent image they shared as misplaced, desiring, and grieving women doomed to solitude built on the idea of an impossible balance between intelligence and women's love, talent, and complementary femininity was not only the result of available romantic languages. I mean, not only were they romantic, romanticas, but of a complex discursive intersection that placed them on the one hand, with an unsettled ongoing debate on social, moral, and economic and political capabilities, as I said before, equality and citizenship, at a foundational moment for liberal society in Spain after the Constitution of 1837, and the rapid development of publishing and reading market that multiplied the audiences and the demand for literature written by and for women. On the other hand, in this context, Avellaneda and Coronado moved within a long transition between the models of classical misogyny, which consider women inferior beings, toward those of a Catholic Enlightenment based throughout the 18th century on the conception of the complementarity of the sexes, that along the way had also reworked the critical imaginary around equality and the non-sex nature of souls that Avellaneda wrote had been, I quote her, dislocated by society and exclusively man-made result. And that brings back the echoes of Feijóo, of whom we've heard about today, but also in Monica's talk and others, but also advances later feminist arguments on the last decade of the 19th century that Inmaculada Blasco referred to in her talk too. That same Catholic Enlightenment had also produced the models of rational femininity on which both writers stood as women, not only of extraordinary talent, but committed to and capable of participating in social reform as it was circulating at the heart of European liberalism from the mid-1830s. In this case, Coronado embodied the reformist woman as she launched a whole network of women writers and intellectuals throughout the national territory that denounced the situation of slavery in which women were confined to the domestic space and dependent on women. In this context, Romanticism offered them renewed languages to represent the contradiction which the new liberal society had placed them, inside and outside of it, as lovers with no possible reciprocity or complement. As Coronado wrote when referring to Avellaneda a few years later, about her, sometimes two truths that seem contrary to each other are found together, but all absolute statements are false. The true explanation of things is achieved only by transitions through their extremes. End quote. Romanticism thus facilitated those connections between apparently incompatible truths, like Avellaneda's mixed masculine and feminine nature, or like the possibility of being talented and complementary that Coronado longed for. From that possibility, they imagined hybrid, mixed, and disordered conceptions of femininity and masculinity, imaginary lovers and religious love poetry, comedies and plays of interracial passion, or profound critiques of the liberal revolution, as well as the real passionate love betrayals and respectable and unusual marriages they had, while claiming the right to be recognized as individuals and as women, to live in equality, love in equality or complementarity, but without their minds getting in the way of their affections and without even giving away their minds at all. Those disruptive connections, the ones Romanticism made possible or conceivable, I wanted to emphasize today were not tensions. The popularity of both of them did decline definitely, I would say, for different, but in both cases, political reasons, after the democratic experience of the 6-year period between 1868 and 1874, much later than that romantic movements highlighted, faded away in Spain around 1850. To conclude, just as we cannot understand text as masked over a subject which is external to them, as would be the case of that idealized female subject previous to and outside discourse, ready to assault the public realm, which should find a way out. Neither can we believe that our real subjects, Avellaneda and Coronado, were absent from and exclusively subjected to discursive context, impermanent change, and with infinite options. Throughout their lives, in their works, after the marriages, in their validity and in public respectability, beyond the fading of an official romanticism, debated and politicized at the end of the 40s, which had only reluctantly and severely celebrated women's writing, both reinvented themselves by reproducing re-elaborating or refocusing their own writing, reworking or refocusing their enduring tension that gave them coherence over time as capable and intellectually competent women whose recognized talent placed them again and again in an intimate and personal place, real with longings and frustrations for not being able to reconcile in public and in private their minds and hearts. As Avellaneda had revealed to Cepeda in the booklet I quoted at the beginning of my presentation, I'll quote her, she was not opposed to marriage, as some thought, but would only marry in the event that she would find a heart big enough to receive mine without oppressing it.